This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hello and welcome to the Sports and Society podcast. Your hosts are Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca. We are talking today with Luke Thomas, the world's foremost journalist on MMA, about media and corporate consolidation. Luke, with you talking about media consolidation on our podcast, I'm hoping that Dana White tweets that no one gives a shit about our opinions. The joke there is Dana White did tweet that about Luke Thomas, but obviously he cared enough about Luke's opinions to tweet about it. So this episode directly addresses Chapter 12 on sports media, but also Chapter 11 on sports economy, and to a degree, Chapter 9 on social class. Luke Thomas is a leading voice and analyst in combat sports whose work routinely crosses media platforms. He currently serves as the host of All the Smokes Morning Combat alongside Brian Campbell. He previously hosted Sirius XM's The Luke Thomas Show, a national daily radio show. He's also a former editor and podcaster at MMA Fighting, which was Vox Media, where he hosted the Monday Morning Analyst and Promotional Malpractice live chat podcast, as well as studio shows such as the MMA Beat and the MMA Hour. Thomas helped create the co-branded USA Today Sports, SB Nation Consensus MMA Rankings. His written work has appeared in the Washington Post, SB Nation, ESPN, and dozens of newspapers across the country. Luke, welcome to our podcast.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, well, we're really excited. Luke is the first journalist we've had on this podcast, so we can't wait to hear what he has to add. So we're going to just start off with the same couple of questions we ask every single guest on the podcast. Can you start off by describing your experience in sports?
You mean like professional sports or like how do you mean exactly?
Yeah, your own biography as an athlete.
Yeah. It's not a particularly impressive one, but basically my story is that I think context of age is important. I'm 46 years of age, so I grew up as an 80s kid. And then the early 90s, 80s and 90s were my formative youth, I guess perhaps is the best way to put that. And, anybody who knows anything about those times is that in the 80s, American machismo was, on an overdrive, whether that was, and again, I'm thinking as a child in that way. So, Sylvester Stallone with Rambo and Hulk Hogan with WWE and then Arnold Schwarzenegger. And, there was martial arts cinema, like that kind of world was, for an 8-year-old or 9-year-old me, incredibly interesting, and I loved it. And then I was never my parents had a very tumultuous relationship, so I moved around a lot. So I did some team sports growing up, but I was, when you're always the new kid, it's a little hard to do that on a consistent basis. But circa 1994 is when I was introduced. I mean, it existed prior to that, but circa 1994 is when I was introduced to the Ultimate Fighting Championship, which was at that time in a very, very raw state relative to what it is now. Very, very different, underdeveloped, and much more of a carnival sideshow than a state-sanctioned sport. But nevertheless, very, very interesting one in terms of the experiment that it was running, and I got kind of interested in it. And it didn't really materialize into much. I didn't really understand more about sports until, frankly, I did college and then the Marine Corps Reserve at the same time. And then when I did the Marine Corps Reserve, I got back into martial arts because they were at that time developing their own martial arts program, which to me was very intriguing. And so then I got into judo for a bit and other stuff. And this is when I was really sort of very heavy into the weight room. I'm a larger person. You obviously can't tell on camera, but I'm about 6'4" and 280 pounds. And that really began to just sort of set me on the path of making that kind of just a hobby that I like to do. And then the basic idea of like how it all kind of just put itself together into a career is that I had moved from into I grown up in DC. Then my parents moved away, and then I would come back in the summers or whatever. But I came back as an adult post college, and I was looking for a place to train, and then I found one, and they had like several UFC fighters, and this is like 2004, so this is a while ago, obviously, very even pre Ultimate Fighter, which was the reality show that sent the UFC into overdrive and really launched its stardom. And I loved it, and it was a great place to train, certainly at that time. But what's kind of funny was I had guys on the team who would go and compete, and I would remember like getting on the internet and very naively looking for results about what would happen, and you couldn't find any. And then this was sort of the advent, or I should say maybe even the boom period, really, of blogging as a culture, where everyone would have a website, they would link to each other. You'd have 500 word posts, 5,000 word posts, and everyone was just writing all the time. And so I started doing that, and I realized like basically nobody else was doing that. No one else was doing anything like it. I kind of modeled what I was doing at that time based on Andrew Sullivan's Daily Dish blog, if you might recall that, which I think briefly lived either with the Daily Beast or the Atlantic magazine. But that model no one was really doing. I eventually got too old to keep training and enjoy it. I mean, I think what it was that I haven't trained properly since probably 2018. It's too hard on my body, and I didn't like it anymore. But it kind of all worked together in this way to get me to a place, and here I am.
With I used to box, and I remember I was approaching 30 years old, and I just got tired of waking up every morning with a nose just caked with blood, and I couldn't breathe, and you can't blow your nose. It's just like
It's so true.
I'm too old for this.
What I've discovered is that, at least through combat sports, is that injury tolerance, which is the person's self assessment of how bad it is, that can play a very determinative role. But there also just must be a genetic component, because I just knew guys who would engage in riskier activities for longer periods of time and then just sustain fewer injuries. I mean, obviously, no one is immune from that. You engage in enough risk factors and the problems begin to emerge. But some people are like, I would ask them, like, I have a friend of mine who's 41 and he still trains, and I'm like, why do you train? He's like, I don't get hurt. I still love it. And so like in that respect, it makes sense. But like, the kind of funny part was, I remember I mentioned I stopped training in 2018. I went to that school that I was with. I'd kept in touch with many of them, and they were having a party. This was maybe 2023 or something. So it'd been 5 years since I had seen at least some of the people at that gym, although I'd kept in contact with many others. And the amount of people who were like my training class, like the people I was with day in, day out, who had kind of kept going. One of them had just had hamstring surgery. Another one was on crutches. Another one's fingers were all mangled in ways that were unusual. And I was like, you know what, man? If you're going to be a professional athlete, there might be a cost-benefit analysis about how much injury load you're willing to tolerate. But if you're just a lawyer, I'm not sure I understand the value of going to work on Monday with your hamstring ripped apart just for fun. You know what I mean? Like it just didn't make sense for me anymore. But there's a place and time for everything, I suppose.
Yeah, that's for sure. So then I'm curious then, how then with this experience that you had training and serious training, because MMA, like boxing, these are not casual sports. You don't play, or I told some people recently, you don't play at combat sports, right? It's a whole lifestyle. So how would you say that experience of being a fighter translates to the journalism that you do now? How does it help inform the questions that you ask, and what you're trying to accomplish through your reporting?
I want to be clear. I never competed, so I may have trained like a fighter, but I hesitate to call myself one. In fact, I've never done that. Uh, but it all of these things worked in for different purposes at different times. I guess is the way I would answer that. So, like for example, when I got back into training regularly at the age, well, I mean, I've been training before, but when I moved here and wanted to get back into finding a home, let's say, for a gym. Um, that was just for fun and recreation. Like that had no other ulterior motive. I didn't even think of the idea of like, oh, you can just cover MMA as a sport for a living. I had never considered sports journalism. I mean, it just wasn't even remotely on my radar. I just wanted to do something fun. So like that period of my life focused exclusively on those kinds of terms. And then what I realized was, as I began to see that there was an opportunity to even perhaps just as a hobby to discuss these kinds of things, what I realized was, and you got to remember this is, let's say '05, '06, '07, something like that. The vast, vast, vast majority of the people who were trying to cover it had no training experience at all. And it's not like I believed that I knew more than the subjects that I were covering, but I definitely knew more than my peers, or at least not all of them, but the vast majority of them. And that began to inform my coverage because I could understand, to an extent anyway, what I was looking at relative to them. I felt like I had advantages. I could see things that they could not see, or pick up on things that they could not pick up on. And then now it takes on a different role altogether. I mean, it's kind of funny, right? A lot of people have concerns about, let's say, for example, CTE in combat sports. And there might be cases that they can recall of, oh, this guy has bad CTE, or this is a famous case of a fighter being punch drunk. But the truth is, the majority of people who end up suffering, traumatic brain injury or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, like CTE, after the fact, the public never sees again. And I still saw them. I had some contact with, I've developed relationships within the industry, or I remember one time I went to a boxing fight and Riddick Bowe was there, and he just looked to be in really, really poor condition, I think is perhaps the nicest way I can say that. And so then what training does to a person, and more importantly, if someone is going to engage in this kind of training for ultimately the purpose of prize fighting, what should the cost benefit analysis actually be here? If you're 25 and you get stuck one time with a big shot in sparring and you get your bell rung, you're very likely to blow that off. But now you're 45, your career is finished, and all that accumulative damage, it ends up meaning something. It means something for your quality of life. It means something for your ability to pursue a reasonable professional career post-fighting. It means any number of different things. And so the experience and training meant less about, if someone does A, then you do B, or I just like doing it. And it turned it into, what should be guardrails around this industry, these practices, and what do we owe these guys who end up in this place? Are we treating them the way they deserve to be treated while they're actively competing, to mitigate ultimately what the effects of this can be long term? I just want to make one final point. Boxing fandom is unique relative to MMA fandom. For folks who don't know this, boxing fandom is one of those kinds of things. It's more akin to traditional sports, where I'll make something up. If your dad is I'll use the local example. If your dad is a Washington Nationals fan, and your dad, if you have kids, it's very, very likely that you will also be a Washington Nationals fan. There's almost like this hereditary inheritance that happens through generations. MMA is not like that. At least it hasn't been very often. It's got a very, very shorter life cycle where people get attached to it. It burns very hot, and then they kind of fade out over time much more quickly than they would with boxing. And the reason why it's important to say this is because it then makes addressing issues of long-term health and safety much harder, because you're not arguing with the people who have been there for a long time, who might understand the full depth and breadth of what we're trying to do. It's just a new class of fans all the time, and new classes of fans have this adoration for combat sports, and frankly, I might even argue a bit of a bloodlust that older fans are a little bit more hesitant about. And I think all of my experience and understanding all of this, it's just kind of changed over time.
Wow, that's incredible. And it's a really interesting point about the MMA being such a new sport relative to boxing. Because I think about, growing up in the 1970s, watching boxing with my dad, just like you said, right? Developing an attachment to the sport. And so then when I got older, I was like, well, I don't think it's ethical for me to just watch boxing if I've never done it. I have to put myself in there. And one of the things that was really learning for me was how repetitive the training is. That was something I didn't expect, because I had done lots of sports growing up. I played football in high school, rugby in high school, all these different sports. None of it was so repetitive as going into the same little gym, 5-6 days a week. And I think about when we talk about the CTE, we used to spar 5 days a week. You're not supposed to do that, apparently. No. But back in the 80s and 80s into early 90s, when I was training, that was just normal. And people think about concussions with CTE, but it's really all of those subconcussive blows. And when you're an amateur and not very good, which I was, everyone's punching in the head. Nobody wants to punch to the body. So you're just constantly you're constantly having your brain banging around inside your skull. So there is all of that. And it leads to, I think, your discussion of Riddick Bowe. For folks who are listening but aren't boxing fans, Riddick Bowe was a heavyweight champion of the world back in the 1990s. And he was just an extraordinary fighter. And, we watched him, he went to the Olympics, I believe. He was a decorated amateur, fought in the Olympics, and then became a professional, became a world champion, had lots of great fights, tremendous fights with Evander Holyfield. And so you, as a boxing fan, you have an emotional connection to somebody like a Riddick Bowe, who you watch grow up. Like for me, he and I are about the same age. We got old together. And I think that this point that you're making is so crucial to what we're talking about today. The subjective relationship that a fan has with an athlete, particularly a combat athlete, versus the business practices, and the way in which that athlete's labor generates profit and money. For people who are really far removed from that training and from that experience of being the fighter, and as you said, the toll it takes on the body. But before we get into that, a lot of our listeners almost all of our listeners are college students. They're reading the textbook, Sports and Society. Many of them want to have careers in sport, whether it's sport management, coaches, other kinds of support personnel, but also in journalism. And I think your career is really fascinating that you have built as a journalist. So can you kind of just walk us through how in this transitional period in sports media, you've built a career as a journalist and as an independent journalist?
One thing I would like to say up front that I think is important to establish as a context, because this is not exclusively true to combat sports. It'd be a question you would have to ask yourself no matter what sport you wish to get into, either journalism or perhaps, be an agent or whatever the case may be. But for those who might be tinkering with the idea of combat sports, I really want to say something before I get into my particular journey, because it will inform all of your decision making. Namely, you need to understand what this is. Okay. On the combat sports side, this is a depletion machine. This is what that is. And what I mean by that is there is absolutely no possible way to come out of combat sports a better version of the person you went in. Now, there can be lessons you can learn from a character standpoint as you age and things like that. But in general, this will just take from you your life, either quite literally or pieces of it along the way. And the reason why this is important is because it informs, at least it has for me, it has informed my judgment about what my role and the media side should be, what I owe the athletes, what I owe the sport, what the truth is, and what the responsibilities are therein. And anybody who has watched the life cycle of a fighter from amateur to pro to high level pro to maybe even champion to now that is long since after, and now there's the other side of their life. I have watched the whole thing. A lot of fans can't say that. I can say that, certainly on the MMA side too. I've watched the whole thing. And when you watch the whole life cycle and you watch what it does to them on this end of the spectrum, it makes the other parts harder to rationalize. It can be done, and I think that there is a case for it. But I just want to say this up front. This is a depletion system. It can only take. And so, as a consequence, make your judgments based on what role you're going to have in the depletion system as a result. In terms of my particular journey, it's again, because it was so never, I mean, eventually it became quite intentional, right? So eventually things picked up to the point where I was like, wow, maybe I can do this full time, and at that point it was off to the races. But for long early years, it had no direction, it had no purpose. It started out, as I indicated, that a guy came to me who was working for, it wasn't even called Vox Media at the time, it was just called SB Nation, and they were looking to fill out, hey, we need people to run these websites for a very, very low amount of money. And again, it wasn't because I wanted to do that for extra money, I just was doing it for kind of fun. And then the story I always tell people is that Brock Lesnar fought Frank Mir. And I looked at my traffic that night, on my web traffic, and it was so huge. It was it was so beyond what I thought was even possible. I was like, if I can do this consistently, I can just do this for a living. Anyway, that would come later at a time. But at first I thought I would just provide, the kind of insight that I thought was missing at that particular time via the weblog kind of system, the blog system. And then what I eventually realized, I'm going to say maybe early 2000s, it began to dawn on me that there is, at least within the combat sports space, it is very, I was not a bad writer. I was a decent writer, but you have to be like a really, really good writer for people to consistently read your writing. In other words, you can only do that. Like, you have to be so good at it, like, and that's your focus. That's like the only thing you can do. I realized there was a much bigger opportunity to do video. And so I began to kind of move in that direction slowly over time, whether that was live video on YouTube being the predominant way in which I would interface with the sport and everyone else. And that was, to me, probably the biggest difference maker I've ever done. That is the thing that helped me to do anything else I wanted to do, in part because YouTube itself now is its own revenue generator. But early YouTube wasn't quite like that. Like, YouTube has actually gotten significantly better about making it monetizable. Like, they have different tools. Like, you can go live, for example, and people have super chats and they can just send you money. Like, that didn't exist, 15 or something like that. But I realized that as a promotional vehicle, YouTube was unmatched. Like, I remember it was kind of funny. I did a show briefly on Spike TV. You might recall. I mean, I doubt your students know, but this is the existing Paramount Network used to be called Spike TV, and it was geared towards young men. And I had a show on there that was live every Thursday called MMA Uncensored Live. And the studio we did it in was in Times Square. It was the old TRL studio that MTV used, the Total Request Live, like right in the heart. You can see Broadway right in front of you, like this amazing thing. And I thought to myself, wow, man, I really made it. I'm on national TV and it's live. And I would walk down the street and I'd get recognized, and not a single person ever recognized me from the show everyone was from YouTube. Every single, to a man or a woman, every single one was from YouTube. And it was clear to me after that happened so many times, I was like, that's where the energy is. And I just began to use that either as a way to make myself attractive for other projects I could sign on to, or as a way, just a means in and of itself, as a way to produce content. But the content, I think for the most of what I've done traditionally has been, fairly ordinary MMA content: fight previews, fight reviews, fighter interviews. Here's me on location. What I would say is, in the last several years, regrettably, MMA and combat sports generally is changing in ways that I find, it makes me despondent, quite honestly. I think I don't use that word lightly. On the boxing side, they are completely in bed with the Saudis, and they're, for the most part, off network television. All of the main promoters are on DAZN. Most people don't have a DAZN subscription. I don't know what that does for the state of American boxing, and I think I would ask most people outside of Jake Paul influencer world, can you name 3 boxing champions, especially if they're Americans? I suspect that they cannot. And then on the MMA side of things, it has become a monopoly. And the reason why all of this is important is because I mentioned this being a depletion machine. I'm not suggesting to everyone out there that anyone promoting is inherently a bad person. There can be exceptions to that rule. But what you should also understand is they don't mind making a buck off of broken people. And you look at Dana White's portfolio, whether it's Power Slap and now boxing and now MMA, it's like, how do you read pro-humanity into this worldview where it's just massively depletion of all these people, to say nothing of what it's doing on the dollar side of them as well. But the reason why I bring this up is because other people have noticed it, and it has enabled me to have a focus now where I don't have to go to shows. I don't have to do all the same, hey, how was your fight camp kind of interviews. I can now have a bit of a focus on these more, I would argue, more important issues, quite frankly. And because of all of the tools that exist within the industry now, whether that's Patreon, whether that's Substack, certainly YouTube, Twitch, any kinds of these places where a person can develop their own following, and that following can then monetize their career, it creates certain limits. I want to be clear about that. However, what I told you guys before this, and I'll say it to all the students listening, there has absolutely never been a better time to be independent. This is far and away the amount of tools, the amount of obstacles removed. This is the golden era, so to speak, of becoming independent. And as again I mentioned, there's challenges with that, but that's kind of how everything has kind of guided for me.
Yeah, I just want to add something, a question here. You're talking about MMA as a depletion system, and Jeff and I have talked about a number of sports being partial depletion systems. And we know about the emotional connections that fans have with athletes. And when those athletes disappear, that emotional connection just kind of fades a little bit until somebody brings up somebody's name. And I'm wondering, you talked about the self-censorship that that some people use who are doing YouTube shows and things. But I'm wondering about censorship from above, and in some of the legacy media, the major sports media. Can you talk about, have you ever felt any kind of a censorship restriction on what you've said? And what are the censorship restrictions that face the announcers and the broadcasters in some of the major sports media?
Corporate media makes quiet censorship a core function of how it operates. And you might say, oh, well, if you're at ESPN, you might be with a powerful entity. If you're, name some major organization, there can be some truth to that. Let me just tell you what my experience has been. My experience is that media organizations will lay down in the face of pressure 99 times out of 100. They will not protect you. Let me give you a great example through MMA. I don't know how often they do it these days. My understanding is they do it less. They haven't stopped, but they do it less, which is the UFC yanking your credential. So, right. So the way it historically works is, hey, I'm a reporter for, I'll make something up, the Washington Post. I want to go to the next UFC event. I'm going to apply a couple months out for a credential. This is when I show up. I get a seat, usually ringside. It can be sometimes in the back or elevated, but let's say, cage or ringside. And this enables me to go to media events during the week to ask people questions, blah, blah, blah. And I get to do it for free. I mean, you have to pay your own way out there, but the media service itself is kind of granted. They will deny your credential if they don't like your coverage. And it used to be there was this belief, for example, that, oh, if that happens, the media institution will go to bat for you. No, they will not. They will let you hang. Absolutely. And they will watch you do it. I really hope, if there's anything a student listening takes from this experience, is that these big corporate media institutions, they will not protect you. If the choice is the league or you, they're going to pick the league, or the advertiser or you. They're going to pick the league or the advertiser almost every single time. It is very, very rare that they would ever, ever, ever go to bat for you. That's sort of one form of quiet censorship. And the reason why I call that quiet is because it may not necessarily even be involved, hey, you take this down or blah, blah, blah. No, it's someone self-censoring before they even get to the point where it gets published, because they know if they get out of the Overton window of what is acceptable discourse, it will cause problems. But it certainly goes much further than that. I mean, I can just tell you with great authority, UFC has told various outlets never to hire me. And they have listened. They have listened to that. That's sort of another example. I don't know if I've ever lost a sponsorship over it. That is at least one thing I haven't had to face. But, between them trying to affect my ability to gain employment as well as access to these events, I made a very different choice. I realized that the game in that particular sense is kind of rigged. Now, some people might say, hey, look, all I want to do, whether it's football or MMA or whatever, I just want to break down film and I want to do that. If you're doing something like that, then maybe what I'm about to tell you is not really a relevant consideration. But the reason why I say this is like the golden age of being able to be individual is that the choice I made was, like, no one forced this actually on me. I kind of basically did it to myself. I decided I didn't want to play this game anymore. I did not want to play a game where I have to wait for a call because I said something in a video or I published something on an article, and now the entity in question doesn't like it, and now they're threatening my ability to have gainful employment. Because if you work for a major corporate outlet and then your credential is denied, you're not of much use to that corporate outlet anymore. They don't care about adversarial coverage. They care about your ability to deliver access. And I just decided I didn't want to play that game anymore. I am not going to do that. So I began to pivot in directions, and it wasn't all at once. It's sort of slowly over time, to pivot in a direction where I just had maximum freedom. And the reason why this has worked for me is because in a world where everyone is restricted in what they can say, I am free. I am absolutely free. I have nothing holding me back. Now, I don't get access. I do. There's a trade-off. I lose that. Again, there's been different opportunities for employment have been denied me to this. But if you have an audience that you have cultivated and you can monetize that, I don't need any of those things. It turns out that none of that stuff matters. And more to the point, just on an ethical basis, like, what do you owe the profession? What do you owe the audience, actually, for that matter? And I believe that telling the truth is only a bold act in a very strange world. But if combat sports is anything, it is a very, very strange world.
Yeah. And by the way, that's one of the reasons we're talking to you right now, is that finding someone who's been able to take that position and maintain a career is sometimes tough. So, but let's get,
it's funny. I did. So, there was this White House card, how long ago was it at this point? Like a month ago, let's say, or roughly. And it was so funny. I did an enormous amount, more media than I've ever done in my life in terms of interview requests. And I had to stop telling CNN yes. I just couldn't make time for it anymore. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I did Wall Street Journal and El País, and I did Pablo Torres. I did everything. And one refrain that I kept hearing from the producers who booked me was that they had a hard time finding anybody else. People just didn't want to talk on the record. And it's like, okay, thanks, fellas. I appreciate the opportunity to get my name out there, because no one else is willing to do that. They would rather just go along with the sort of fictions that allow them to be part of the in club. And I just don't care about any of that stuff.
It's funny. There was so much coverage of the UFC fight night at the White House, on the White House lawn. I got interviewed about it. I don't study MMA. I'm not an MMA fan. I'm like, I don't know anything about it, but they're like, if you want a sociologist who can talk about nationalism and hypermasculinity and politics, then yeah, I'll talk about those things. So one of the things I wanted to ask, I wanted to get you to talk about is, so I can't assume that all of the students that listen to our podcast know about MMA and UFC, and you've been there since the beginning. Can you give us a brief history, a kind of thumbnail history of the development of MMA and how it's gotten to this point where it's now making you feel despondent? And to use that to talk about some of the issues around corporate consolidation and the developing of monopoly.
So, some of this happens by virtue of my own naivete, which obviously there's less of these days. But that does play a role here. Let me just give you a very brief explanation of how MMA, what is it and how we got here. And I'll make this super simple. Basically, in the 90s, there was a Brazilian family. It turns out, if you really want to get super specific, that the Japanese were working on a different version of MMA at the same time. They don't really get credit for this development. But suffice to say, for the United States, right, for our purposes, that there was a Brazilian family by the name of the Gracies. And they had developed a style of fighting, because that's what it was at the time. It was martial art called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's still around. It has evolved massively since those days, but certainly at that time. And what they did was they created a competition in conjunction with some people here stateside to make a competition of like all different styles, and whatever style was the best would win. This was actually a really critical question. If you were never around in the 80s, it's hard to understand this, but like all the different martial arts all had competing claims about which one was best. Taekwondo thought it was best. Judo thought it was best. And not just the major ones, but like there was these sort of subsidiary smaller ones that, that what ninjutsu and whatnot, like we're all gonna claim that this is the best style, but like no one had ever melded them because the worlds had never melded. And the UFC at the time, anyway, was one of the first places that was like, well, what if we just put them all together? What happens? And the reason why the Gracies knew that they were going to do well is because back in Brazil, they were doing challenge matches. They would show up to other schools, they would challenge the instructor, and they would win because they had this style of grappling that, the basic idea is that if you've never wrestled or you've never done grappling, if someone is good at that and they get a hold of you, you are in deep trouble. You are going to leave openings that you don't know are there, and they're going to have dire consequences for you. And they knew this, And so they set up a thing where it was under this pretense that, hey, what's the best style? But really what it was they wanted it to be an infomercial for jiu-jitsu. And for a time, that's exactly what it was. But a funny thing happened along the way. They began to attract a lot of other athletes from, let's say, wrestling or high-level kickboxing. And some of their success was uneven, but not necessarily. There would be times where the jiu-jitsu guy would lose quite badly to someone, or there was a point where we thought wrestlers were taking over. And a famous example is Mark Coleman, who was a dominant wrestler in the amateur system, and then came over to MMA. He lost to a guy who was a kickboxer. And he got beaten, and it was this huge, like, oh my God, kickboxers can beat wrestlers, right? And so what ended up happening was we realized it actually isn't one style that is better than the other, maybe not necessarily anyway, but it's all context dependent. And so what the real answer is you got to have all these skills for all these different phases and all these different dimensions. And that is how mixed martial arts came to be. It is something of an accidental discovery in that way. The Gracies did not intend for jiu-jitsu to be frankly marginalized relative to what it was at the beginning. So that's how we get here. The story of the business side and the sort of the despondency that you mentioned is basically nothing worked to make this profitable right up until about 2005. There's a bunch of different reasons for that. Some of it is the rules themselves. There wasn't enough. There was some attempt, obviously, before 2005 to get that to work, but it was kind of slow going, and the public didn't really catch on. There was a cult following for MMA and UFC, but there wasn't a big following for it. And they nearly went out of business. The UFC was purchased ultimately by Dana White and two of his friends who are billionaires, Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta, in 2001. And even that didn't fix it. In fact, by 2004, they were in deep trouble. They were probably going to go out of business. And part of it is, John McCain was calling it human cockfighting. So regulators were going after it. I mean, they got taken off of pay-per-view. It was a big problem. Okay. But eventually what ends up happening is they begin to get better relationships with regulators. They fix some of that. They get regulated. This happened before Dana White got there, but they get regulated in New Jersey. The State Athletic Control Board there is one of the more prestigious ones. So getting regulated by the New Jersey government was actually a very, very big deal. And they made some gains in that way. But the big difference, as I indicated, was in 2005, a reality show hit called The Ultimate Fighter. This was during the reality craze at that time. The public had never seen anything like this. The characters were all unique. I mean, it was real, but I'm calling them characters as, outsized personalities, let's say. And it was a hit. Like, the ratings were through the roof. They did another season. That was through the roof. And this just launched the UFC into a level of stardom that is hard to even overstate at this point. And then subsequent things kept building it. Brock Lesnar comes along circa 2008 or 2009. That blew it up. They bought a rival competitor named Strikeforce. That blew it up. And there was another one before that, a bigger one in Pride in 2007. That blew it up. Like, it just kept building and building and building. Ronda Rousey comes along 2015. Conor McGregor comes along 2015, 2016. It just begins to build and build. And the reason why this is important is because at that time, they still had some, frankly, a great deal of repairing to do with skeptical audiences, whether that was, average sports fans, whether that was regulators, whether that was people who work in media. Like, there was a lot of convincing that had to happen. And so what the UFC did, and this is when I really got on board, was they made they didn't say it quite in these terms, but like, if you were around at the time, this will sound familiar. They were like, look, this is safer than you think it is. This is way cooler than you think it is. And this is going to be for a lot more people than you think it is. Yeah, of course, it's going to, appeal predominantly to men, and particularly white men. But they were very clear that, like, this can be for many more people. We can cast such a wide net here. It was a little engine that could. And oh, by the way, Rich Franklin, our middleweight champion, he used to be a math teacher, and Uriah Faber, who was a Division I athlete, and like all this stuff that they would mention about people having these like third-party validations of success or normalcy, or the kinds of things that put people's skepticism at ease. The reason why things begin to change is everyone will point to 2016 when Dana White speaks he's the lead promoter, when he speaks at the Republican National Convention for Donald Trump. And that certainly, I suppose, if you're trying to catalog when it starts, I guess on a technical perspective, it starts there, but it doesn't really start there. It starts after the pandemic. I think partly the pandemic and the way in which the right interpreted edicts about public safety as, burdensome and onerous and too far. I think that ended up radicalizing people. I think Dana White was one of them. But the real big difference is 2021, January 6th, frankly. Donald Trump tries to steal a presidential election. That's not even a debatable. That is absolutely a fact. Kenneth Chesebro pled guilty to a fake elector scheme. And he is disgraced from office, and he has two different public appearances after that, one a month later at CPAC and then one in July at a different CPAC. But the first real place he goes to get his image rehabilitated is a UFC event. And I'm sure you guys have seen this, where they walk him out, they play his music, the commentators say how great he is and blah, blah, blah. And a lot of people think that, like, what is the value of that? Certainly what isn't the bigger value, Dana speaking at 3 conventions for him? I would argue, no, it's not. If you're someone who is a political candidate looking for office, where can you go? Even if you had all the money in the world, where could you go to buy third-party validation like that? Nowhere. There's no place you can go to get what is ostensibly an event that's not for you. It's a sporting event. It's a fighting event. Where can you go to get that kind of adoration You can't even buy it. It's not even available for sale. And they would do this over and over. And it would often happen in conjunction with, other forms of his malfeasance and the long arm of the law crashing down on him, the Jack Smith case, the Letitia James case in New York. I mean, you name it. And in close proximity, they'd bring him out to this, and it would just, it would be this huge image boost to him, to say nothing of the fact that it ended up turning the sport into a vector for right-wing politics. Here's a great example of that. The Trump administration has confirmed, that there's documentation to this, that they knew the fighters themselves would be great to reach young men, which is traditionally a very, very hard to reach portion of the electorate. So they would enroll them in that. And then downstream from that, fighters at some of the top gyms would hold rallies for local candidates at the gym, all right-wing, obviously, to get them elected as well. And this is all happening, mind you, while the sport is kind of consolidating around a single promoter during that time. I mean, I didn't mention very much of it, but there's a story of how, Pride going out of business was a bigger deal because Pride had ties to organized crime in Japan. That's a bigger deal. But like, for example, Strikeforce being bought out, there was ultimately a fighter lawsuit. And what's discovered is that in certain cases, when the UFC would buy an organization, they wouldn't even do their due diligence about whether or not this was a good purchase. They would buy it just to shut it down, which is like matter-of-factly anti-competitive behavior. You're not supposed to be able to do that at all. So all of this consolidation is happening. Meanwhile, this right-wing turn is unabashedly happening. And now, in the second Trump term, now that they got him back in office, obviously just getting him back to office was, I think the UFC is very responsible in putting him back in there. And I think that they're on the hook for all of the downstream consequences that come from that. But the other thing to keep in mind is some of this was brought up. Like, for example, you saw during the White House card, it's like, oh, Trump bought stock in TKO. Isn't that a conflict of interest? Yeah, sure. But that's really not the big deal. The big deal is they're trying to get federal legislation passed. So boxing has some federal legislation that was put in place, shepherded by John McCain, that, if I ask someone a very basic question, why do boxers make more than MMA fighters? The answer is very easy to say. There's multipolar system in boxing where it ends up happening that the promoter has to bid on the services of a top fighter. If you want Canelo Alvarez to fight in your organization, you're going to have to outbid all the other promoters to get him to come sign with you. That system doesn't exist at all in MMA, and it is partly enabled by this thing called the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act. They're trying to take that act away so that the UFC, now running on the boxing side of things, can monopolize boxing the way they have monopolized MMA. And so it's this political turn. It's this industry consolidation turn. It's aligning yourself not merely with an authoritarian fascist, but aligning yourself with power broadly to get favors from the government that are going to make competition to them essentially impossible long term. This is the source of my despondency.
That's fantastic. And you've actually answered a whole bunch of the questions I was going to ask you anyway.
If these answers are too long-winded, you can feel free to cut me off. I'm just trying to do my best.
No, we're going to let you go, man. You're burning. So this is like, and now you've really gotten to what I wanted to talk about today, which is this monopolization. Now, one of the things that people in boxing argue, because I follow boxing very closely, is that one of the problems with boxing is that we don't have a league. And what UFC could offer, Zuffa, right, can offer is a league that will rationalize this irrational market, where you have all these different promoters competing with each other, and they're aligned with different networks, and they don't want to work with the networks. So if we just have one come in, that will rationalize, and that will make, that will improve boxing. So my question to you is, because anytime there's a problem, and we can say an irrational market creates problems for some people, a solution comes in, but the question always is, for whom is it a solution? Mm-hmm. So if in fact we see a league form in boxing that has never existed, and what you're talking about, this competing, this more irrational market where different actors are forced to compete with each other, who wins, and why would they win? What makes Why is this a solution for somebody like a Dana White?
So one thing I want folks to really understand is you'll hear a lot that like boxing is broken, which is not a claim that I would dispute, but let me just sort of turn it around and say, what if I were to tell you that it was broken on purpose? Right? So we're not disputing that it's broken, but we're actually suggesting that that was done with great intention. Now, what do we want to say about it? I want to start with that kind of that premise. The first thing beyond that I would like to say too is, one argument that you'll hear about the UFC's model, which is also not a league, by the way, they kind of call it that. It's still just a promotion. It's just a promotion that has all the best fighters. A league has like a federated system where teams can, for example, bid against one another for elite talent. That's how, like, for example, like the NFL is a monopoly, but how do guys get a lot of money? Well, because first of all, they're employees, they're not independent contractors. That's part of what enables them to have a collective bargaining agreement. But the other part is, like, if you leave so I'll use my hometown team. If you leave the Washington Commanders and other teams want to bid on you, you have a federated system that allows that. That doesn't exist in MMA, at least not UFC anyway. So it's not even a league in that sense either. But the thing that I understand is, one, I've kind of mentioned this depletion argument before. This is what I mean. Well, let's revisit it here in this particular context. One thing you'll often hear is that, like, well, MMA has a better middle class, right? So guys at the top, Conor McGregor makes a lot, but a lot of the guys at the top, they don't make what top boxing guys make, but there's a middle class that makes more. There is something to be said for that, although that is also overstated. But even if it were true in the way in which the proponents suggest it does, I don't know that it's exonerating in the way that they think that it is. The older I get and the more I see how the industry works, I'm not saying I've fully come to this conclusion, but I'm getting closer to the idea that I don't know if combat sports are even supposed to have a middle class. I mean, the idea here is this is so violent and so dangerous that the way to make this work is to get in, if you're good, get in, make a bunch of money. There is going to be some physical trade-off by virtue of doing it, but you can minimize it if you're not in for very long. You get fat money, and then you go, right? That's how the system works. The trade-off is I'm going to trade off some of my quality of life, not too much, but some, but I'm going to make so much money that, this trade, it kind of makes sense for the right kind of person. But when you're middle class, so to speak, in MMA, you're going to be in much longer. You're going to take much more damage. And yes, you might actually make a comfortable living, but that's nice when you're 28, 33. Well, what about when you're 53? And now you've had, 20 years of fighting under your belt and what that has done to you. I don't know that trade ultimately makes sense. But to answer the question more specifically, understand something that I think, looking at the way in which this legislation that they're trying to get passed would change it. One of the things that there's many things that they want to do, but one of the sort of core insights to really understand this is what they want to control. All right. So the way it works now is you can be a boxer. The boxer signs with a promoter. Okay. And then there's something separate called a sanctioning body. These are the groups you might have heard of, like so-and-so is the IBF champion, so-and-so is the WBC champion. And if there is any criticism to make of the boxing industry, because I do agree that it actually does need reform, it just doesn't need the reform they're offering. The sanctioning bodies have really fallen down on the job because they're the ones who's, like, a promoter's job is actually not to uphold the integrity of the sport. It's to put on the fights that people want to pay money to see. That's their job. That is not the job of the sanctioning organization. The job of the sanctioning organization is to protect the sport's integrity, and they don't do it. So reform for them is needed. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that we're talking about an idealized sense of things. What do? They are the entity that is separate from the promoter, that is separate from the fighter's manager. That's an independent third-party validator of quality and of what they're owed. So, for example, if you are the WBC champ, right? Let's say I'm signed with Jay's promotion and I want to go to Jeff's promotion. If I'm the WBC champ, I leave Jay's promotion and I go to Jeff's promotion as the champ. If I leave the UFC, I leave with nothing. It is literally their title. And in fact, for folks who don't know this, it is actually illegal in boxing to make the promoter for the promoter to try to make their own title. So, like, for example, Conor McGregor was talking about, I might become a champion in the third weight class. He means a UFC champion. That is actually illegal in boxing to do. And the reason why is because they are separating the ability to control the title from the promoter's hands. That is an enormous tool of control. If they can say, and in fact, in the current legislation, what it says is you can't have coercive contracts. What's a coercive contract? It's the idea that if you want, let's say Jay wanted to fight for me, and I said, okay, Jay, you can fight for me, but here's the deal. You want to fight for me? You got to sign with me long term. You want to fight my guy who's the champion? You got to sign with me long term. I am coercing you into a long-term deal that will affect your ability to get a new deal in 2 years by making you sign, let's say, like a 6-year deal. That's a coercive contract. That's illegal in boxing. They want to take that away. And more to the point, they want to be able to take away from the athlete the ability to say, hey, listen, I left this promoter. I signed with this one. I'm still the WBC welterweight champion of the world. My value is still very much intact. All of that gets removed. All of that gets taken away. In MMA, the fighter has none of these things. It is all on loan from the promoter. That's why this legislation, you have to understand, who are they giving control to? Are they giving more control to the athlete? Absolutely not. Are they giving more control to the sanctioning body? They're trying to eliminate sanctioning bodies. They're giving control back to the promoter, to which I would wrap this answer up by saying, someone with who's got the balls, make the argument to me that the problem in boxing is that there isn't enough promoter to boxer exploitation, and what we need is more of it. That is the argument that they're making. That is tacitly the argument that they are making. And so I understand MMA fans look at UFC and they're like, oh, well, one entity's got them all and they can make the fights whenever. They don't make all the fights that the fans want to see, for one thing, but that should be noted. And more to the point, what do we owe the athlete, the guys who are getting brain damage doing this? We owe them a system that enables them to maximize their worth.
You know, one of the things I'll put to students in my classes is, if this was the promoters or the league owners, say it's, NFL, MLB, NBA, whatever, if it's the league owners, the promoters in that ring or on the pitch, how much would you pay for it? And my students always go like, oh yeah, if I could watch NFL owners play a football game, I would pay for it. But I'm like, I mean twice. Would you pay twice for it? Who generates the value? But where does the money go? And what you're talking about here is the coming together of both the legal, this shift from and this is really confusing because these terms sound the same. There's the John McCain Act. What was that, 2002, 2004?
It was passed in 2000 flat, but it didn't go into effect until I think 2 years later, yeah.
Okay, the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act, and they're trying to replace it with the Muhammad Ali American Boxing Revival Act.
Right.
It's very confusing because the names sound almost identical, but one is dismantling the protections that the athletes have, the people that generate the value. They're trying to dismantle those protections so the people who don't generate any value are able to get a larger share of the value. There's the political aspect of all of this, the way that Dana White and Donald Trump have been supporting each other, going back to Trump's days at the Taj Mahal. So there's another part too, and we haven't gotten, you mentioned it earlier, but we haven't really got to it yet, which is the Saudis, right? There's the Saudi General Entertainment Authority and its chair, Turki Al-Sheikh. They've had this enormous impact on combat sports. So this will probably have to be our last question because we're getting to our hour. We're gonna run out of time. Can you talk about this Saudi General Entertainment Authority that has been accused of sports washing, and Al-Sheikh, who has been accused of human rights abuses? Like, who are these people? How do they come into this?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, the Saudis might be like a very what do you want to say, easy example to point out, like, oh, that's sports washing. But like, I would ask MMA fans who, are not hopelessly blinded by their own partisanship, what exactly do you think the White House card was? I mean, that is I mean, if that's not sports washing, nothing is. So, to be fair to the Saudis, for just a moment, they are hardly alone in this. But if we're asking on the boxing side, because it turns out that like the UFC, this is another thing too. Like once you understand UFC's like corporate DNA, they're all about maximum control at all times. And then to that end, I think that the Saudis would like to have a greater role in how UFC is run, and UFC just won't give it to them. Boxing, because it's sort of like a secondary sport for the organization, or the broader organization, which is called TKO. I think they're a little bit more willing. But the basic idea is real simple. Somewhere along the lines, after the Jamal Khashoggi killing, several years, the Saudi
just really
government,
quickly, he was a journalist who,
yes, Washington Post reporter who wrote in many worldwide Arab newspapers and whatnot, and was a Saudi national, goes to the Saudi embassy in Istanbul to get some papers worked on, and they kill him and cut him up into pieces, and never to be seen again.
and it was argued that he was cut up, he was dismembered while he was still alive.
Yeah, with a bone saw, no less. And, there was huge worldwide condemnation of this, at least at the time. And, people were withdrawing their projects from all Saudi-related things. This is to say nothing of their existing human rights abuses, which are also beyond that quite bad. But sometime after that, they realized we got to do something about our situation. And they've done it a number of different ways. They've tried to become a leader in events. Like I know for my wife's a corporate event planner. Like they get pitched all the time at her place about like bringing stuff to Saudi Arabia. But the biggest way that you could sort of understand it is through sports. So they've been involved in like F1. They have been involved in, all different kinds of things. They did a flag football thing with the NFL as well. But it goes deeper than that. They've bought teams in the English Premier League. I mean, it's a huge thing that they go and do. And they're not the only ones. UAE and Abu Dhabi. I think, if I got this right, Qatar purchased 10% of Monumental Sports, which is the brand that owns the Washington Mystics, Capitals, and Wizards. And I think there's even like Visit Abu Dhabi stickers on certain NBA teams' jerseys, right? So it's almost like this sort of GCC kind of thing. But again, making it about the Saudis, they kind of realized that like if we can get involved in mainstream sports, there is a way we can just normalize how we're seen. Now, it's more than that. They also want to diversify their own economy. They've got a lot of young people who need stuff to do. It's still a restrictive place, but if you can bring, let's say, UFC there, if you can bring Formula One there, if you can bring the World Cup there, you can begin to diversify how the country runs and what it's known for, and what kinds of neighbors and alliances or relationships you can then pursue. And it has worked very well for them. I don't think you can look at Saudi sports washing and say, or at least their attempts anyway, and say this has failed. It has not failed at all. It has been very, very successful. But perhaps the place that has been the most is boxing. And the reason why I say the most is because it's not that boxing is the biggest. I think, Formula One in certain respects is bigger. It's that in boxing, or even live golf is perhaps another one, although live is now kind of collapsed. But boxing, there was just no friction. There was no friction at all. The culture inside boxing, this was true well before the Saudis ever got there. It's a prize fighting culture. Like the name of the game is to get the biggest amount of money possible and get out. Like that's what boxing is. People want to think it's other things, that it's heart. That's all that it ever is. So it was ripe for the picking, to the end where now Turki Al-Sheikh is the guy you named. He's the guy who has access. There's different kinds of sovereign wealth funds, but he's got access to one of them. He is not a royal, but he makes people call him His Excellency. And what they've done is they've not only become a place where they're bringing a bunch of fights to Saudi Arabia. Now, since the Iran war, that has really fallen off, and I don't know what the future of that part is. That's hard to say. And again, they've dialed back from sports more generally because of the war. So all of this is a little bit in play, but up to this point, they've like Canelo fights 2 times a year, Cinco de Mayo and Mexican Independence Day. They had Canelo fight on Cinco de Mayo in Riyadh, and it was a disaster. But like that's how much money they have. They were to pull him out of his place with a huge amount of money to go do this. They were making fights being possible by just throwing money at it in ways you never imagined. They bought a prestigious media outlet called the Ring Magazine. It's now just a mouthpiece for them totally. They have, I'm going to say, not quite total control over the industry, but almost total control over the entire boxing industry. To that point, the UFC's boxing effort, which is called Zuffa Boxing, they're partnered with Turkey and Sela, which is this organization you mentioned, the essentially the promoter of record, the Saudi promoter of record. They're all working together. So understand, on the American side, they're trying to change this legislation that will enable them to monopolize it while using Saudi money to attract people to get into the system as a way to then have a long-term ability to then dictate prices over the course of, a generation or so for what they pay for athletes. And it's had a really devastating consequence for the UK and the US market, I might add. Fights that are supposed to take place here between rivals have just been put over there. And what some boxing fans will tell you is, okay, but the Saudis paid for fights that otherwise might not have happened. And there is some truth to that. They've paid so much money to make certain fights that were just, prohibitively costly. They've been able to do that. But now they're dialing back on that, and yet they still retain the control because they just embedded themselves in the system. Boxing exists in large part, not exclusively, but in large part to serve the interests of the Saudis. And I think that when you say that out loud, people think that's hyperbole. That's just a fact.
So I'm gonna squeeze one more question in here, because I'm just thinking about the student that's listening and they're a little skeptical. They're like, yeah, okay, boxing has always been crooked. It's always been in the back alleys. There's always been poor kids that have been exploited by promoters, and now that's extended to MMA. So you got a new, discipline, combat sport discipline. Politicians and business people, they've always been aligned, but I'm a sports fan. I just want good content. How do you respond to someone that's being skeptical and they're viewing this from a consumeristic mode? The product that I want, the fun and spectacle that I want is being made available to me.
Yeah.
What about them? Why should they care?
Yeah, this is an easy argument to win. Maybe the easiest one of them all. Yes, when they first enter a market like this and they're throwing a bunch of money, it seems like, wow, this will be great forever. But of course, this is not what their long-term plan is. Their plan is to have control and to not have to spend that kind of money, because when they spend enormous amounts of money, it looks cool on TV. That's true, although it actually doesn't work sometimes too, right? Because if they put a show in Riyadh that's meant to be in San Antonio, the crowd just doesn't care in the same way. It feels kind of dead. But putting that aside, the reason why this is such an easy argument to win is because I'll just ask a very basic question. Someone tell me what their favorite monopoly is that serves their consumer interests outside of this. Someone tell me what it is. And they might say, what about the NFL? Okay, great. I'm glad you brought that up. The NFL has a system where, the athletes are employees. They're not independent contractors. They have a league federated system. Well, so again, if you leave the Commanders for free agency, you can get bid on by the Raiders. You can get bid on by the 49ers, whoever. This keeps the prices up. It keeps the quality high. More to the point, the athletes have the ability to care for themselves in a way that the collective bargaining agreement, maintains a degree of, health and safety standards and minimum pay and blah, blah, blah. Like, it just makes the whole thing work. None of those things are in place inside of combat sports. They're not employees. There is no collective bargaining agreement. They are independent contractors. And I'm just going to keep asking people who say, for example, like, the UFC model works better. Then why have the last 2-3 years been nothing but fans belly aching about none of the fights they want being made, how they have a star problem? They haven't created a superstar since Conor McGregor. He's quite literally on his last legs. The reality is that when they first get going, it looks nice and shiny and it looks nice and new. But a monopoly system without any of these other checks and balances to maintain athlete quality, to maintain product integrity, which they don't have in these other systems, it can only go one way, and in fact has been going one way. What's kind of funny is boxing's model is completely different than the UFC's model. We mentioned all the regulation and everything else, and yet both sports have a star problem. When Anthony Joshua goes and Canelo goes, who's the next big American boxing star? I mean, Anthony Joshua was British, but and Canelo's Mexican, but because there's so many Mexican Americans here, he's basically an American star too. When he goes, who's the next big one? Errol Spence, Bud Crawford, he's retired too. Who is it? Is it Virgil Ortiz? Is it Boots Ennis? Like, these are names that nobody knows. On the MMA side, it's something different. The idea, think about it this way. Most content now in a lot of places is just designed to be a morphine drip, right? You don't get too high, you don't get too low. What you get is a steady drip of content all the time, right? It's a systematized version. That is the model of that they're going for. They're not going for, yes, occasionally there will be a big fight and occasionally there'll be a big rivalry. But what they're really going for is just like banquet food. My sister and my brother used to own a restaurant. And I remember one time I went on a trip with my sister to Spain, and we would go to these tiny restaurants and they would be so good. And I'll be like, why can't they just make this restaurant bigger? Why do we have to wait in line for this? And the way she explained it to me was like, well, think about it if it was bigger. Imagine you had, instead of feeding 30 people, you're feeding 3,000 for a banquet. The food can't be that good because you have to systematize it in such a way that it reduces quality and the kind of real sort of like deft hand that you need to make it excellent. That is the model. That is where it is, frankly, arrived in to a large degree, and certainly where it was headed. And the last thing I would say about this is, my wife is from South America, right? So I spend time in Colombia frequently. I've been going for many, many years, many, many times. I don't even know how many times I've been at this point. Everyone I know there has a maid. And I often hear from people Americans who go there like, oh, wouldn't this be great to have a maid? And like, on some level, it's like someone else to take out the trash, someone else to, I don't know, make your bed or, whatever, maybe. Isn't that a nice thing? And like, it sounds nice, but the reality is any economy that has a relationship where people can easily afford an underclass's service to just take care of their daily needs, this is a deeply unequal place. And that inequality, there is a bill due for that, whether you like it or not. It shows up in the form of violence. It shows up in the form of a reduced tax base. It shows up in the form of government corruption because no one really believes in the system anymore. Like, it shows up in a lot of different ways. I cannot think of a worse idea than going for a system that leads to long-term, and visibly we can say it as much, banquet food that is treating the people who are the most responsible for trying to make it excellent as a secondary underclass. I just cannot imagine what the argument for be to think that that is what's long-term. Anybody who makes an argument about a sports league that they like, none of them work that way. Not the Premier League, not the NFL, nothing. Formula One, nothing. All of those work with better protections in mind for all the various stakeholders, and their success in that regard is no accident.
And that brings us back to where we started talking about Riddick Bowe. If these are athletes that you love, that inspire you, but they're going to be depleted in this system, I mean, there is a moral question at the end of the day that you have to ask. And I think that the way the media works so often is it keeps people from asking those questions, from seeing this moral calculus that you're laying out here and all of the unseen costs that are then connected to it. So fantastic, Luke. Thank you so much for coming on. This is an amazing episode. It's all the time we have for today. Unfortunately, Jay and I could sit here and listen to you for another hour or two easily.
And our sport management students certainly could, if they have an open mind and if they ask critical questions, could talk to you for a long time.
That's right. So thanks so much. We need to stop it here. For our listeners, please keep an eye out for our next exciting topical episode of the Sports and Society podcast. And you can always join the conversation on our Sports and Society Discord server. There's an invite link available in the episode description.